Hi everyone, it's Gigabeef here, and today we'll be talking about the SVD. This gun holds a unique position within EFT, as it's the only non-bolt action that fires the big 7.62 54R bullet, which it shares with the Mosin and the SV98. With 20 round mags and incredible damage and penetration, the SVD is a weapon to be feared by even endgame players. So stick around and let's get going. By the end of this video, we'll be looking at building this weapon, which I think is a great build for the SVD, although this can be a little more subjective than for other guns, which I'll explain later on. But before we move on to the higher tier mods, let's go through the basics. Given what we want to use it for, the stock SVD is pretty decent already. This can be found on Prapor level 3 for 92,000, but is pretty much always on the flea market for 60 to 70k. The only SVD in the game currently is the SVDS, which in a similar fashion to the AKMS means that it has a folding stock that cannot be upgraded or changed. However, BSG have been adding more compatible parts to the weapon over time, so there are a couple of choices in terms of modding, but it's not all that complicated after running through it once or twice. It has a base recoil of 173, which is pretty high, but it doesn't matter too much at longer ranges when sniping. For pure comparison, the Hunter is 216, but close up it can cause an issue when unmodded if you end up in a sticky situation and you try to spam fire in point shoot or canted mode. But as mentioned, there's been a few attachments added to the game, so it's more flexible than it used to be. For the most budget build with the SVD, this is actually very similar to the Hunter. You'll be looking to fire massive bullets over a long distance and avoid close quarters combat. To this effect, the most cost effective version simply takes the stock weapon for about 65,000 on the flea market and adds the PSO sight on the side mount from Prapor level 1 for 19,000 rubles. This is actually perfectly adequate if you're looking for that slower sniping style gameplay, but even in this loadout I would argue that the SVD is superior to all the other bolt action weapons in the game on performance, purely down to the semi-auto capability of the weapon. The ability to fire the Mosin round on semi-auto is just so good for getting off follow-up shots to secure kills, and the Thorax health increase to 85 has made some difference to the effectiveness of individual shots. This is one of the reasons that the player base is so happy with BSG's latest decision to allow all bolt actions in the next patch into the Tarkov shooter questline, as currently they are hardly used in the game, which is understandable given Tarkov's realistic round modelling and the lack of 500 meter plus combat means that there's just few areas that actually benefit from the high precision of the bolt actions that isn't outweighed by the ability to use the semi-auto fire mode. Do note however that as the SVD is a DMR, it doesn't contribute towards your sniper ability like the bolt actions would, so it isn't useful for leveling that skill for the Tarkov shooter questlines themselves. Use the stock SVD and PSO scope if on a budget and just want to give it a go, but as mentioned, be mindful of close-up trigger spamming. Consider bringing a secondary budget gun for close combat just in case. That being said, we might want to add a few mods if going in more geared and we want to improve the performance that we get out of it, partly given the relatively high base cost which lends itself to some improvements. As mentioned before, we'll likely be sniping with the SVD, so we won't want to simply focus on minimising recoil, as you'll likely be holding ADS and aiming for extended periods of time when scanning for enemies and in fights. Reducing recoil is all well and good, as is improving ergonomics for quicker ADS times, but the biggest benefit for mods from snipers in my opinion is being able to hold the weapon up for longer before having to recover your arm stamina. This is one of the biggest issues with the heavy long range guns if you're not able to find a great place to go prone, so we should keep this in mind as we look through our options. If you want to do some light modding, it's at least worth adding the CAA XRS handguard to allow for foregrips which are not supported by the stock handguard, and it's easy to replace without having to adjust the rest of the weapon. We probably want to use something with a good ergo stat, but without losing too much recoil reduction. If you're going cheap, either the Magpul AFG grips are dirt cheap on the fleet at less than 10k and are actually quite good for this purpose with 8 ergo and 1.75% recoil reduction. The best in this category is the Fortis Shift from Peacekeeper 4 with 11 ergo and 2% recoil reduction. The RVG Black is another contender with 3% reduction and costs 10k from Peacekeeper 3. To go any further with our build, we'll need to look at how the SVD is put together in Tarkov. For starters, there is only one barrel, which is the 22 inch, which you'll just get with the weapon. Likewise with the stock, there is only one, which is the default folding stock, and only one gas tube too. Then there are two routes with the modding: the upper band and a regular handguard with the standard dust cover, or straight up with the SAG Mark 1 free float chassis for minus 4% recoil, and 11 ergo from Mechanic 3 for 17k, and the custom dust cover for 1.5k also from Mechanic 3, which gives 2 ergonomics. Just to note, if you do go for the SAG, the mounting ports are then blocked and you can't use any side mounted scopes or rails anymore, but you do get a long Picatinny rail along the top of the whole weapon, which also lets you natively install canted sights using the NC Star backup mount. Typically this feature doesn't bother me that much, as I hardly use canted sights to be honest, unless when using a thermal to give me a non-thermal view, but if you like using them, then this is the config that allows it on the main weapon. Otherwise, I generally use sights with multiple modes for medium and long range, and utilise lasers for short range fights, but it's definitely personal preference. 5 seconds before we continue, please don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more content like this in the future. Alright, let's carry on. Going down the upper band and regular handguards route instead, there are two choices, which is the XRS as we mentioned before, with -1% recoil and 7 ergo from Mechanic 2 for 10k, and the modern handguard for 15k from Prapor 3 with -5% recoil and 7 ergo, which is actually the best you can get recoil wise for the SVD. The XRS takes vertical foregrips natively, whereas the modern handguard needs a Magpul M-Lock 4.1 inch guide from Mechanic 2 for 1.5k, or it can take the Magpul M-Lock foregrips directly from around 10k from Peacekeeper 3 for 9 ergo and 2% recoil reduction, so actually very close to the Shift for about half the price and more accessible. With this route, you don't get a regular Picatinny rail for optics on top, but you can use any of the side mounting solutions, of which my favourites are the ones that sit nice and low along the weapon, such as the SVD low mount from Mechanic 3, which costs 10,000 rubles, which incidentally gives you +1 ergonomics, or the CAA XD RGL for 7k from Mechanic 2, which takes away 2 ergonomics. The SVD can also take all of the standard AK pistol grips, the best of which is the RK3 as usual for 9k from Skier 3, so just use the best one that you can to get that ergo stat up. Muzzle devices are extremely limited currently, with the only option being the Rotor 43 762x54 muzzle brake and suppressor from Skier 3 for 51,000. This does give -3% recoil, but removes 2% accuracy and also hits the ergo by another 9. To fit this, you'll need to add the Rotor 43 thread adapter from Mechanic 3 for 2k. Now this is a bit of an expensive option, and does decrease the range at which other players can hear you firing, however just don't depend on it keeping you stealthy at short and medium range, as it's definitely not all that quiet. One final piece to note is that even on the base SVD, you can attach a laser really easily to the barrel, as there is a part called the CAA DRG for 3k from Mechanic 2 that fits straight on, and you can use any of the usual laser targeters, of which I tend to use the blue NC Star as it's the cheapest at 5,000 from Skier 1. So ultimately the best build is a bit subjective, but I think on balance the one I like the most is the suppressed SAG version with the Fortis Shift. This costs 109k on top of the base SVD of 60 to 70,000, so will set you back around 170 to 180k in total, for 47 ergo and 143 recoil, and although the other method with the modern handguard gets marginally better recoil at 139, it has only 43 ergo instead. I think in this case it's worth forgoing the extra marginal recoil reduction to get better ergonomics, especially since we still have the scope and the mag to attach. For scopes, just use whatever you're comfortable with. Elcans, Monstroms or Hammers are just some of your options, so the choice is yours, and if you're not sure, you'll learn from other builds as well, because the scopes are pretty much all shared between the weapons. However, for me, you'll rarely go wrong with the Valde on the SVD, and although it's not cheap and more of a higher end choice, it is very very good on this gun. By the way, the Tan Elcan is my favourite general use optic if you're not willing to spend this much on the Valde every game. Two other important considerations are ammo and mags. Let's deal with the mags first because they're more straightforward. You can get the 10 rounders from Prapor 3 for 4k each, or the 20 rounders from Prapor 4 for 10k each. There is a 1 ergo difference between the two, so if you can, just get the 20 rounders. In terms of ammo, all of the rounds for 7.62-54R are pretty good to be honest, so it's quite hard to go wrong, although be careful of the T46 as firstly it's a tracer which can give your position away and get you killed, and technically it's the worst round in this category. The usual argument or discussion here is between 7N1 and SNB as the main routine rounds. 7N1 is a terrifying bullet against low tier kits, as with 86 damage it is possible to one-tap level 3 armor with a hit to the Thorax, and is one of the few rounds in the game that can still do this after the Thorax health buff to 85 in the recent changes. This stuff is legendary early wipe, and it's still nice to be able to kill scavs and Mosin men in one hit even later on. However, with a pen of 45 versus SNB's 62, as the wipe progresses there is definitely a case for using SNB, especially given the SVD is semi-auto and you're not reliant on one-taps to the head to get kills. Using Veritas' Battle Buddy, a 7N1 round only pens 37% of the time to level 5 armor at full health, whereas SNB will pen 97% of the time. However, remember SNB will always need 2 shots to kill given its damage of 75, which is true for scavs and unarmoured players as well. 7M1 will still deal very high damage to armor when it hits and doesn't pen, and at half durability, it'll go through level 5 91% of the time, meaning that the second shot is much more likely to go through and kill, obviously depending on what your opponent is wearing and how much damage it deals to the armor in the first place. Personally, I actually don't think there's too much in it between them, and they're both great rounds. You can buy 7M1 at 719 rubles per round from Prapor 3, and SNB for 517 rubles from Prapor 4. One more great advantage about this ammo class is that no limb is safe from being blacked unless using armour on the arms, which is quite uncommon, and if you get shot with 7M1 in an unprotected right arm for example, there is still 26 damage left to splash over the rest of the body. Really scary to play against when any mistake results in a black limb. So all in, for a top end build with 20 round mags and a Val date, we're looking at around 260k for the whole thing, with the base SVD at 65, mods of 110, a nice scope of 45, and magazines with ammo of about 40k. I love the SVD and I've had some great times with it, and it has its rightful place amongst the cheaper player killers for a good reason when using the budget version, as well as a full on thick hunter when kitted out. So remember to sub and hit the bell if you want to see more. You can also follow me on Twitter, and I stream on Twitch on Wednesdays, Fridays and Saturday evenings UK time. So until then, I'll see you next time, and as always, have fun in your raids.
Ugh.